So by statute, I am the chair of this committee as an appointee of our executive director. Very proud of the work that we're going to be doing here and excited to get this thing launched off. And want to thank Mitch Craddock for organizing us this morning. And more importantly, I want to thank all you because I know you're all very busy. This is a 3-hour meeting scheduled out of your day, and I know everybody has a lot of other important work to do. So grateful for everybody's participation in making this program better, and just the notion that we can take some of these funds and plow them back into the communities that you guys work and live in is really what makes this job what we all love about it. With that, I am going to go ahead and do a round of introductions since this is our first meeting and everybody might not know each other. Again, I'm Dave Bowman. I'm the interim director for the Division of Local Government. And I have the pleasure of working with this team who gives out a number of various grants across Colorado, and they serve local governments with technical assistance, including everything from special districts to the law enforcement community. With that, I think what I'll do is I'll just kind of tag the next person. If we could hear from Major Ansari.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Major Ansari. I currently serve as the commander over our staff services branch at the Colorado State Patrol. Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you. Do we have Julie Gonzalez on the call? Javier Mabry. Debbie Stafford.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm Debbie Stafford. I'm the Legislative Director for Aurora Mental Health and Recovery, and I'm also a former state representative for House District 40. Thank you for a great day, and good morning, Commissioner O'Dorisio.
Let's see, Lori Jenkins is up next. I think you're on mute, or actually you're not showing on mute, so there must be an audio issue. We'll skip you and then we'll come back to you. Thomas Hernandez.
Hello, everybody. I'm Tomas Hernandez. I am the founder of Tribe Recovery Homes. I'm a Colorado native and advocate for recovery and reentry.
Great. Welcome. Do we have Kenneth Bowling?
Yeah, I'm Ken Bowling. I'm the representative for the law enforcement organizations. I'm with the state Fraternal Order Police, and I'm the 37-year veteran law enforcement, retired.
All right. Well, thank you for your service. Amber King.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I got married since when I was actually asked to come on the board. So my name is Amber Bartholomew. I work with NRT Behavioral Health. We have several treatment programs across the state of Colorado offering various services. Some of the programs that we have are Foundry Treatment Center, Chrysalis Continuing Care, and the Michael Barnes Family Institute. And I do outreach and special projects for the organization. Nice to meet everyone.
Great. Welcome, Amber. Lauren Sharp.
Good morning. I'm Lauren Sharp. I'm the police chief for the Fort Morgan Police Department.
Excellent. And last but not least, Steve O'Dorisio.
Hello, my name is Steve O'Dorisio. I'm a county commissioner for Adams County, but I believe I'm representing counties on this board. So I look forward to working with all of you.
Great. And we will circle back to Lori.
Can you hear me now? Is that better?
Yes, that works.
I'm Lori Jenkins, the Executive Director of Kindred Kids Child Advocacy Center. We also provide direct services to our Canyon City Police Department as well as Custer County Sheriff's Department.
Welcome. And then, let's see, I would like to have my staff introduce themselves and then see if there's anybody else on the call today.
I'll go ahead and go first. Most of you are familiar with me, at least at some point today. My name is Mitchell Craddock. I'm going to be the program manager for the Law Enforcement Community Services Program. I also manage the Defense Counsel on First Appearance Program and the Civil Asset Forfeiture Reporting Program, which is actually tied into this, and we'll go into that a little later. So I'll pass it off to Brett.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. Brett Hilberry. I am the financial assistance manager on the team where Mitchell's programs fall and some other state grants programs fall. So really looking forward to launching this program. Thanks for being here again. And Allie, I'll kick it over to you to just say hi if you're listening in.
Yeah. My name is Alejandra Madrigal. I go by Allie. I have been a program assistant for various programs with DOLA here. So very excited to listen in today.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. And I'm going to, well, no, I'm not going to turn it over to Mitch quite yet, but Mitch, I did take notes as we were doing introductions. We do have a quorum, so I'll send you the, well, you can see who's here, and we won't have to do the roll call formally. But first, I'd like to open it up to any public comment. Doesn't look like we have any members of the public on this call, but all right, hearing none, then I'm going to just kick it off to Mitchell and let him run us through the agenda.
So before we jump into the actual agenda, here we have to go through annual training. It's required by statute for all program committees. It shouldn't take very long, but it'll kind of give you a better idea for the role that you're going to be serving while on the committee. So actually, I need to exit out of this slide really quick. So this is just some of the areas the annual training is going to cover. So committee roles, requirements and responsibilities, program purpose, relevant statutes, and best practices. Sorry, I had to switch slide decks there. So essentially, this is specifically some of the items that the annual training is going to cover. It was created by House Bill 181198. It requires bylaws of statutorily created boards and commissions and annual training on statutory directives, intent and laws, purpose, goals, and bylaws of each program, conflicts of interest, covers the Open Records Act as well as the Open Meetings Act, identifying and securing data for informed recommendations, ensuring appropriate involvement in communications and policy making, ensuring members act within their roles, coordinating with other boards and commissions, and annually reviewing management practices to ensure best practices are used. So the Law Enforcement Community Services Grant Program, it's outlined in Statute 2432-124. The committee shall continuously review and administer the program and, subject to available appropriations, award grants as provided in this section. And this is more along the lines of program purpose and committee role. They should also make continuing recommendations to the department, including on policies and procedures developed pursuant to timeframes for applying for grants, grant application forms, timeframes for distributing grant money, criteria to be used in awarding and denying grants, review grant applications, and recommend which grants should be approved. And this just goes more into the purpose. So the purpose of the Law Enforcement Community Services Committee, and this is pulled directly from statute, is to give grants to law enforcement agencies, local government entities, and community organizations to improve services to the communities. Eligible expenses will include policing and outreach, drug intervention, prevention, treatment and recovery, and other services. And at this moment, this is the extent that these eligible activities are defined. And we'll jump into this a little bit later, but we'd like to maybe further define other services, but I'll touch on that later. Conflict of interest. All conflict of interest forms for 2024 must be completed and returned to DLG. I actually have most completed forms from everyone here on the call. We might be missing a couple. So in those cases, just at your earliest convenience, go ahead and complete that and return it back to me. Matters where private, pecuniary, or property issues or interest of individual committee members are discussed must be declared on your form. You may remain in the room for purposes of maintaining a quorum, but should not participate in any discussion or influence the decision. Any appearance of, let's try to avoid any appearance of a conflict of interest. So this is the Open Records Act. These are just some of the guidelines we have to keep in mind while communicating during committee meetings and through email. State policy is that all public records shall be open for inspection by any person at reasonable times. A 3 business day turnaround for requests is allowed. All meetings of 2 or more members where any public business is discussed are declared to be public. Emails between committee members can be quora'd. All quora requests are managed by DOLA's executive director's office. So this is the role of DLG staff. So myself, Brett, Dave, and other folks that may not be on the call here, to provide information to allow the committee to make informed recommendations to the executive director, ensure appropriate involvement in communication and policy making, ensure committee members are aware of their roles, annually review procedures to ensure best practices are applied, and maintain knowledge of program status, issues, and concerns. So shifting over to the committee roles, and again, this is pulled directly from statute. Review and make recommendations for program applications, changes to guidelines, policies, and bylaws. And actually, we're going to dive into that a little bit more later on in the meeting. And that concludes our annual training. Does anybody have any questions? If you do, you can always reach out to me anytime and I'll try and get you an answer. Jumping it back to our original slide deck. So we're just going down the agenda here. So we discussed this a little bit in the annual training. So the program purpose. The purpose of the LECS program is to give grants to law enforcement agencies, local government entities, and community organizations to improve services to those communities. And we went over these specific activities earlier. So policing and outreach, drug intervention, prevention, treatment, recovery, and other services. So this is just a little program background, how the program was created, and why it took a little bit of time to launch. So the LECS program was created in Colorado's 2018 legislative session through House Bill 181020. And this just goes into some of the activities that 181020 addresses. So civil forfeiture reform, expansion of the scope of civil forfeiture reporting, and they wanted to use some of the monies reported out from the civil forfeiture reporting program to help give back to the community. And that's essentially how this program was developed. The program is further outlined in Colorado Revised Statute 2432-124. 25% of proceeds of seized personal property will be granted to the Law Enforcement Community Services Grant Program Fund pursuant to Colorado Revised Statute 2432-124. So what that means is all seizures and forfeitures reported on throughout the state, 25% of that total goes into this grant program. On average, it's about $225,000 a year, but it does fluctuate, as you could imagine. So this just further breaks down that 25% total. The other 75% either goes back to the seizing agency or the agency to which those items were forfeited to, and another state program. So as you can see so far, we've accumulated just under 1.3 million. So and actually it gets added to on a monthly basis, roughly. So we might actually be sitting at a little bit above this today, but this is generally where we're at right now in terms of total program funding. So I'll stop there and see if anybody has any questions.
This is
Good.
Debbie Stafford. I just wanted to ask real quick, will you be sharing these slides with us?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Mitch, I just had a question on the appropriations.
Yes.
I assume it's continuously appropriated.
That's correct.
So we're not confined to a fiscal year at any point.
No, I don't believe so. Yes, I to my knowledge, it's a continuous appropriation.
Okay.
Usually when money gets put into the program fund, I'll get an email, and it's at a I would call it a monthly basis, because it depends on seizures and forfeitures that are reported. But I'll usually get that email that there's been funding added to this total. So.
Okay.
So with that, I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So this is, at the moment, this is the full roster of our committee members. Most of us are on the call right now. If you have any questions or curious about anybody's background or current position, you can refer to this. Again, to Debbie's point, I'm going to send this out after we conclude this meeting, and you can refer to this. The term length in the farthest column to the right, and I believe these were in your emails when I communicated your appointment to you. Some are permanent, some have a limit. For those that do have a limit, you can always reapply to the program, and we'd be happy to have you back. So if you see that and this is the first time you're seeing that, that's just what that means. And it's defined in statute that that particular appointment that you're filling within the committee has a term limit. So once it reaches that limit, you can always reapply. So most of us are on this call here. This is the internal DLG staff. These are just folks that are going to have some interaction within the program, whether it be approving applications, making recommendations for funding, or approving reimbursement amounts. Most of your interaction is going to be with me, but there's a chance you could hear from Brett. Tamara would be our finance assistant director, and unfortunately she couldn't be on the call today. And Mr. Eric Bergman is actually going to, he's the incoming director for DLG, and I think he's going to chair the committee eventually. So you'll probably hear from Eric a little bit more. So the purpose of today's meeting, and this is just one of the goals, is the committee will help define the following: eligible recipients, which right now defined in statute as law enforcement agencies, local government entities, and community organizations. So the first two, law enforcement agencies, local government entities, are pretty well defined. I think we have a pretty good understanding for what that is. Community organizations might spark a little more discussion in terms of what those organizations would be, what activities would they be performing to be eligible under this program. And I think one of the largest parts of today's discussion is going to be eligible expenditures. So right now, defined in statute, those expenditures, or activities rather, are community services such as policing and outreach, drug intervention prevention, treatment recovery, and I think the one we're going to define a little bit more is other services. But that's further on in the agenda. So goals for this meeting, review program procedures. So, and I should have sent these out in an email, I think it was last week, the procedures and bylaws, to make suggestions and revisions. Review rating criteria. This is just going to be what's used to rate applications. Should we have a large influx of applications once it opens, the rating criteria will help us review those and determine which ones are priority and have the highest need. Next, we're going to identify specific eligible activities. And then we're going to discuss the preliminary timeline for opening the first application. So policies and procedures, I can go ahead and pull these up on the screen. Let me, my apologies, I'm going through a couple different tabs. There we go. So I'll go ahead and exit out of this, and I'll go ahead and jump into those. So program policies and bylaws. So these are going to be the rules that govern. Go ahead, Brett.
Could you make that a little bit bigger?
Absolutely.
Please, Mitch? Thanks.
How does that
Thank
look?
you. That looks better. Thanks.
So the bylaws and the program policies are actually somewhat tied together. They're the rules that are going to govern the program as well as our roles and our duties while serving on the committee. You can look at the bylaws as the general rules that are going to govern program activities. And I would say the program policies just specify specific processes of how those rules are going to play out. And that's kind of how they're related, if you were curious. So because we're in the policies document right now, this is broken down into just a few different areas. So general administration, eligible recipients, eligible activities, the application process itself, rating criteria, funding decisions and how those will be made, and advisory board details. So because this is a larger document, I think it's 7 or 8 pages, I'm not going to review the entire document here, but I do want to check to see if anybody has any questions based on the document I sent out last week. Or did we have time to review it? If not, that's okay. We can always adopt what we have right here, what we've drafted and I'm sharing. I know it's kind of hard to read as I scroll through a 7-page document. We can adopt this today because a lot of these sections we're actually going to discuss further in some of our future action items. And if we discover down the road that there is a change that needs to be made within any one of these sections, we can have a discussion in terms of why that change is needed, what the change should look like, and if that change should be made. So just for your awareness, once you dive deeper into this document. Same thing with bylaws. Bylaws are a little more solid than program policies. Again, they're a little more general too. So there shouldn't be too much reason for bylaws to change. A lot of this is coming directly from statute too. So there's not going to be too much of a reason to kind of pick this apart the same way you might do with program policies. But if you do see something that stands out that does need to be changed or addressed, you can always let me know and we can start that discussion. So I'll stop there to see if anybody has any questions on either of these documents. If not, I'll go ahead and proceed down the agenda. So again, this just goes into more of what I was discussing earlier. So policies and procedures provide a roadmap for the day-to-day operations. Bylaws are a little more broad, but it's very much related. They ensure compliance with laws and regulations, give guidance for decision making, and streamline internal processes. So review rating criteria. And let me make sure we're not trespassing on a break. We'll take a break after this section. So the rating criteria is actually found within the policies and procedures. It's part of the same document. And what this is going to do is it's going to help us rate applications as they come in, or it makes sense because some applications are going to look different. The activities are going to look different, and it'll just provide us a template for pretty much how to look at these and prioritize each one. Rating criteria is designed to encourage the acceptance of applications that demonstrate the most need. The rating criteria is divided into 4 scoring groups. Each contained a graded question specific to overall goals of the LECS program. The higher the score, the more qualified the application. And so here's just a snapshot from the policies and procedures document. This is currently how our rating criteria is broken down. So the 4 different scoring categories are going to be: first, demonstration of eligibility; demonstration of services to the community; demonstration of need, which currently the way this is set up is actually the most important piece of scoring criteria; and demonstration of ability to spend funds. So, and I'll go through each one of these points. And I'll go into more of how this is going to be used once application starts coming through. So the 3 points within this piece of criteria here are going to be: application demonstrates that seizures and forfeitures were reported over the past fiscal year. What this means is, according to statute, only law enforcement agencies and organizations that reported a seizure or forfeiture technically would be eligible for this program. And the purpose behind that is, what our legislature is saying is, if you had to, instead of retaining those funds that were seized, you've given up this percentage, we're allowing you an opportunity to recoup that percentage back, as long as it's going back to assist the community from which those funds were seized from. Does that make sense? I know that was kind of complicated. For example, if a municipality, let's say they had no seizures reported the previous fiscal year, technically, according to statute, they wouldn't be eligible for this program because they hadn't reported any seizure or any percentage reported out, a part of the CFS program.
Mitchell, this is Debbie. So I'm assuming in the due diligence, if an RFP is received, that will have already been kind of vetted out.
Yes.
Thank you.
If I'm understanding your question correctly, I also track each seizure and forfeiture that's reported throughout the state. So I already have the list of municipalities, agencies, and counties that have reported or performed a seizure.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Mitch, I have a question just from a process perspective. So you're going to be receiving all of these applications. Are you going to be rating these based on these criteria and presenting them to this committee for their approval, or is there a process by which the committee themselves actually rate these?
Great question. So, and I can get into this a little later. I've created a form for each committee member that I'm going to share out. It reflects each scoring category that we're looking at here on our screen. And essentially, it's a yes or no question to each one of these bullets here within each one of these categories, whether or not the application that you're looking at meets each one of these guidelines. So essentially what this is going to look at, and right now the tool that I'm using it's just a Google Sheet, and I'll share it with each committee member, their own sheet. They're going to look at each application, which again, I'll share through our Google Drive, and I'll also email out to, and as you're looking at the application, you can just check yes or no within that sheet according to each one of these bullet points. The way the sheet's going to work is a yes. It's generally going to be 1 point, with the exception of demonstration of need, which is 2. And a no is going to be 0. And at the end, once you're done rating, it's going to give you a numeric total. And then I'm going to be viewing those totals as they come in. And at our next meeting, once that's scheduled and we join that meeting, we'll discuss the different scores that came through for each application and then determine which ones are priority from there. Does that answer your question, Dave?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. If not, I know that was a lot. Feel free to stop me and ask additional questions.
Well, and just to make sure I'm clear, it's the committee then that's going to be rating these, and the application will be there. They'll be reviewing those application and rating those and
Yes.
averaging those scores will become averaged. So, and then you'll review those at that next committee meeting.
Yes, that is correct.
Right. Okay.
And for everyone on the call here, I promise it's simpler than it sounds. And I will I'll probably follow up with those specific sheets that I'm going to share out to each committee member, what it looks like, how to use it, probably after this call, just because it's so much to digest right here and now. But I promise it's much simpler than what it sounds. And if you have questions, you can always reach out to me, give me a call or send me an email and I'll make sure it gets addressed.
Well, and I think to Debbie's point, some of these you can actually fill out. Like, for example, the first bullet, application demonstrates that seizures and forfeitures were reported over the past fiscal year. We wouldn't expect each committee member to go look that up when we already know the answer.
That's
So this will be something like that would already be in there for them, right?
That's a great point, Dave. Actually, and yeah, let's plan on that being the case. So as applications come through, I'll have the list of seizures and forfeitures reported throughout the state. So I'll compare those applications as they come in to the forfeitures and seizures reported. If that municipality has not reported anything in the previous fiscal year, I won't even share that application because technically they're not eligible.
Okay.
Great question and great point. The next bullet point down is application demonstrates that enough seizures and forfeitures were reported to warrant an award. And I put just a total of at least $1,000. What this means is because of the amounts, actually, let me back up for a second. Again, statute states there's a specific amount to which they're eligible to receive back from those forfeitures reporting. I think it's the full total from what they've reported is what they're eligible to receive back. So I put $1,000 here just because I couldn't imagine an activity taking place within the community under $1,000 being worth the time, the manpower it takes to actually create a contract, do all the reporting, and actually execute those activities throughout the community. So I kind of just came up with $1,000 as our threshold. What does everyone think of that? Does that sound reasonable? Excellent. If you think about it later and that seems problematic, just let me know and we can readdress it. The next bullet point down is going to be substantial totals of seizures and forfeitures were reported that will support extensive services to the community. This is kind of tied into the previous point. What it means is, let's say a municipality reported $1,000 in seizures. That means they're eligible to receive $1,000 back as part of this program. $1,000, because that's our threshold, it's going to be limited in terms of the activities that they can actually perform throughout the community that can make a difference. Let's say another municipality, however, reported $50,000. So that's obviously $50,000 is a much larger total. You can do a lot more with $50,000. And that's just saying this municipality as compared to the municipality that reported $1,000 has a much bigger scope to work with in terms of community services. Yes, Debbie.
A quick ask, is it beyond our scope if we were to be encouraging our law enforcement communities to be sure that this reporting is taking place from their departments?
My answer would be no. If anybody feels differently, let us know. I think
I know my style. I'll be bugging everybody.
perfect. And that helps me with the reporting process too for CFS. Go ahead, Dave.
Well, two questions. One is I'm assuming that you will have this information in front of you
Yes.
because you get those reports from the seizures. But that $1,000, or in the case of the 50,000 example, are you looking at that over the past year or the past 2 years? What's the time frame for that?
I believe it's the past fiscal year. So what seizures were reported throughout the past fiscal year, and I believe that's the cutoff, because there has to be a timeline cutoff. Otherwise, we can go back in time for years and years, and that amount can just keep growing by, in some cases, millions and millions of dollars, which we don't have.
But currently, we have 3 years of seizures in that pot, which probably doesn't.
So the LECS program, in terms of the funding amount, so that can accumulate. In terms of the reporting for CFS, which is a separate program but related to this, in the sense that the municipalities are only eligible for what they've reported seized. That actually goes. That's more what I'm referring to, is how much have they reported as seized or forfeited. And that was actually created with this program in 2018. But and my apologies, I don't have the bill up in front of me at the moment, but I believe there's a cutoff at the fiscal year mark in terms of what they can report they're eligible to receive.
Okay, so for this initial pot of money, if I had or contributed seizures 2 years ago, I'm not eligible to receive an award in this first award cycle.
I believe that's the case. And actually, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and just take that as a lookup.
Okay.
To ensure that what I'm saying is correct and I'm not making too much of an assumption. But I believe, I think the only other option would be, and I've got to go dive back into the bill, is they could possibly be eligible as far back as when the program was created. So civil forfeiture, that reporting program started with the same bill that created the LECS program, House Bill 181020. So I would say 2018. The other option would be they can report or they can request totals from 2018. But I'll take that as a lookup, and I'll get back to everybody here on the call with what the actual answer is.
And Mitchell,
Okay.
I'm reading the bill right now. Oh, also
Okay.
give you
Oh, thank you, Debbie.
And I guess one more clarification, and sorry to keep picking you
No,
with
go
these
for it.
questions, but I'm assuming that we're going to be looking at the applications based on their merit and how they will positively impact the communities. And they're not going to be constrained by that actual local government contribution to the pot, right? And what I mean by that is, let's say, last year from my community, there was $10,000 worth of seizures, but I have a program that's going to cost $20,000. I can still apply for more money than I contributed, right?
I believe it's capped at what they report in terms of what they can receive from this program. And I can go ahead and take that as a lookup too, but I believe they can only request up to what they reported out in seizures and forfeitures.
Yeah, let's,
Otherwise,
let's look that one up, because what's going to happen is some of these communities aren't going to apply. So we're always going to have this money that we can't spend if everybody's limited to their cap. So if there's no way to get the unapplied for money out the door, it's just going to sit there. So that's something to think about, but we'll have to look at what the bill actually says and what we can do.
definitely. And I'll get back to the committee with those answers probably after this meeting. In terms of what seizures and forfeitures look like, and I'm kind of shifting over to our civil forfeiture reporting program. Most municipalities actually don't report any seizures and forfeitures. Throughout the state, I would say maybe 25% do on a regular basis, and those amounts fluctuate quite a bit. As you can imagine, between Denver, Aurora versus some of the smaller communities in the mountains and eastern plains. But I'll be looking at those totals as applications come through. But I don't believe that a municipality or agency that did not report a seizure or forfeiture is actually eligible to apply for funds. And I think that's kind of related to your question, Dave, in terms of the scope of a project. If that is $20,000, but they've reported only $10,000, I believe that $10,000 is the cap. So, but I'll verify and I'll get back to the committee on that. So does anybody have any other questions for the first scoring category? The more we go through this, the more I'll just go ahead and say I'll complete the first category because I'm looking at those numbers. And if an application meets these guidelines and actually comes up with a number, especially only applications that have reported seizures or forfeitures, those are only going to be the applications that I share with this committee. If they haven't, I won't share them because they're not eligible. The next category is going to be demonstration of services to the community. So this is going to, oh, did someone raise their hand? Maybe not. This is going to be more related to the community in terms of the services that are actually going to be performed. So the application clearly details the services provided to the community and its benefits. So that's pretty self-explanatory, I think. The next bullet's going to be application provided clear data that justifies the need for funds related to services provided to the community. And the third is going to be explicable detail provided on how the demonstrated services to the community have improved services to communities and how funds may further this goal. So does anybody have any questions on those pieces of criteria? It's pretty straightforward. So we'll see how those applications are structured. Different folks might complete applications differently. So some of these could warrant a little more discussion as applications come in because some of it might be a little subjective, but we can discuss that when that time comes. The next category is going to be demonstration of need. I mark this as the most important category because this is determining the priority in which we need to be giving funds out to communities and agencies. So the first bullet here is going to be application clearly identifies plans for both how and what the funds will be used for. The next is going to be the applicant has successfully provided a justification on how funds will enable the continuation or creation of a program to better the community at large. And the final piece of criteria within this category is going to be the applicant is currently receiving funds from outside entities. They clearly detail why the first allocation was not sufficient to provide necessary community support. And what this is we're just saying that there's already either a solid plan in place for these funds, or there's an active project in place in which there's a need for additional funding to successfully execute that project. Yes, go ahead.
I just want to add, it's important for us to note that district attorneys and prosecutors are also required to be reporters. And
That is
so
correct.
does that expand then the scope of how you can include RFPs? Just something to think about.
So that might actually come in a future discussion in this meeting in terms of identifying other organizations. That's actually a great point, and you're correct. So we would want to define in terms of how that district attorney's office relates to the community. I'm not quite sure what that would look like. If they can apply for funds, I would imagine they should be able to apply on that from that standpoint, as long as they either have an active project in place or they're working with a community organization that has a project in place. But we can discuss that further.
Thank you.
It's actually an action item. Yes, Major.
So you had mentioned how this category was marked most important. Are they weighted differently or are they equally weighted categories?
So this one's actually going to be heavier. Each point within this category is going to be worth 2. The other categories, each point is going to be worth 1. And the thought process behind that is if there's a community that has a higher need than another community, we believe at this point that that community should be prioritized over the other. If there's let's say if one community is impacted harder by the ongoing opioid crisis than another, that community that has the harder impact should be prioritized over the other community that does not have the same scope of that issue. And that's kind of what we're getting at here. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. Does anybody have any questions over this category? If not, I'll go ahead and shift to the final. So demonstration of ability to spend. So what these bullets are getting at here is, can they spend the funds? Is there the staffing in place? Is there the plan in place? Infrastructure, things like that. So just going down the list here, the application demonstrates an ability to spend existing funds based on community need. Next is the applicant has shown a budget and how funds will help enable it to provide community services. The third is going to be, are there ongoing community relationships that already provide eligible services to the community? And the final is going to be, local governments have the staffing and resource capacity to draw down funds. So this category is more logistics of, can we actually execute this plan? And really, that's really it. Does anybody have any questions? And again, if you're looking at this in the future or throughout this meeting too, you can always just stop me and we can address it. So with that, I think we actually have our first break. And I'll stop it right here. And yeah, we have a 10-minute break and we're actually ahead of schedule. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break and we'll rejoin the call at, we'll say 11:05. Does that work?
The math's a little off there, Mitch. It's 10:51 now, so 11:05 to be closer to a 15-minute break.
I figured because we're ahead of schedule, and it's a nice even number. So I don't know. We can keep it at 10 minutes. So let's join back at 11:01. See you guys in 10.
Great. Thanks, Mitch.
Okay, everybody, it's about that time. So if we're all back, we'll go ahead and jump back into the agenda. So next on the agenda is going to be identify specific eligible activities. So what we're going to do here is we're going to narrow down on what specific projects and efforts are needed throughout the communities. So identify specific eligible activities. Activities defined in statute are community services such as policing and outreach, drug intervention, prevention, treatment and recovery, and other services. So I think this is probably going to be one of the most important parts of this meeting. We're going to be more discussing along the lines of what are other services. And we can also further define policing and outreach, drug intervention, prevention, treatment, and recovery. And really, we can also talk about what some of the issues are if we do know those throughout our communities, and that can actually help us better define what those services should be. So,
And Mitchell, Dave has a question.
go ahead, Dave.
Just looking at the agenda, we had an action item to approve the rating criteria. Did you want to?
Oh, my apologies.
put
Let
them
me.
all- we can do them all at the end if that's easier. Why don't we do that?
Okay, sounds good. So with this discussion in terms of what the need is, what the activities should be, this is kind of an open forum, and if anybody has any ideas, feel free to bring them up and we can start discussing them as a group. Unfortunately, I tried to find a little bit of history on this program in terms of what legislators had in mind when they created this. I actually was not able to find anything. Based on the criteria that we're looking at in front of us here, though, it seems like a portion of this, or if not most of it, is probably designed to address the ongoing opioid epidemic and related issues to that. What are other people's thoughts on that? Go ahead, Commissioner.
Yeah, I don't know if it's limited to just the opioid itself, but maybe any. I think we clump together opioid with all the greater drug and other sorts of addiction issues. So I don't know if it's related to addiction broadly, or if it's limited to addiction with illegal substances, and then is it further limited to just opioid? I would say keep it as broad as possible to address addiction and where mental health might overlap with that, based on what I see here. I also don't see a specific thing that says that the community policing has to be limited to that topic either. I think community policing, from what I'm reading here, is a separate bullet point, is different than the others. So I say you keep it as broad as possible to help address these issues, but that's just my opinion. But that's what you asked for.
No, absolutely, and that's great feedback. I just use the word opioid epidemic because it's something you hear about affecting our community so much, but it definitely shouldn't be limited to opioids specifically, I would say. And in terms of policing and outreach, we could even expand that beyond drug intervention and prevention if we wanted to, I would assume. But what are other folks' thoughts on that? Go ahead, Debbie.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I actually believe that, and I'm working right now in some conversations to help law enforcement and fire and EMS create chaplains that, and a diverse pool of chaplains that can actually go into the community and help be supportive. It's voluntary, but there is software that can be put on every phone of any employee within a law enforcement agency to help manage their behavioral health and identify if they have needs, and it can be tied into a chaplain program. And so I really think there could be some creative opportunities to get boots on the ground into the community when there's, people are hurting or something's going on, and they can work in tandem with local law enforcement.
So specifically, how? And I'm just trying to process that more. How would that application be used in a real life scenario? Just so I understand.
The application would actually probably be more internal to law enforcement departments to help their staff feel that they have a safe, confidential way to go identify their own behavioral health challenges and identify depression and other needs. But it's kind of a confidential tool, but it can also be expanded so that chaplains can use it in identifying ways of supporting. It's just a tool I'm learning about, but it really makes me think, and the cost of it's about $40,000. So that's what the cost of it. I thought, it seems like there's stuff like that also could help internally and externally to be more supportive for healthier law enforcement communities.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. Thomas, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. I think would be wise for us is to kind of watch the ball on what grants and opportunities, RFPs and RFQs that are out there, that the new mayor of Denver, his big, huge initiative that was just in the newspaper. Yesterday, I just testified on a committee for the alcohol monies that they're trying to put taxable. That's a bill that's up right now. Let's see what's coming. Let's see what's already in place. There's a big Caring for Denver initiative that's been released that will be appropriated in September to a lot of different organizations. I think if we could streamline what is out there, what is happening, and how we can be effectively putting the monies either supportive on top of that or getting creative in different pockets, would behoove us to go that direction so we can be effective with each dollar. Because I've noticed with myself getting my organization to where it needs to be, a lot of different things overlap, and there's a lot of broad stroke on just saying mental health and recovery, and a lot of people are doing the same exact things. So getting a little bit more strategic on that so we can make sure that we're helping these folks in the proper manner. I think that would be a good direction for us. Also, at the same time, the data and the organizations that we work with, I would just have a question on how we're going to collect our data, how those reporting systems are going to happen, and what the support of these organizations that moving forward. Because when I was just green out there putting an application in and I had to learn data, it was kind of a hike, but I was fortunate enough to have the infrastructure of each time that I received money, I had a little bit of coaching from the person that gave me the money to make sure that my budgets and my data and everything, what are those key points of each one that we're doing for our data points and the collections and how we're appropriating that money out, what's our approach to that? Because at the end of the day, once we give this money, we also want to get a lot of this data back to our group, correct? We want
Absolutely.
to make sure we're really effective on that, and we don't kind of get a little crazy, because I know working with the city, there's like 6 people that are collecting data, and then we got to get a data team, and we're all like overlapping things crazily. So we don't want to get in that mess. But that's just my 2 cents on it. But there's a few things I can email a list that I know of, and then also that are House bills that are out, and I could keep that pace with my lobbyist and send out an email to let you guys know what's coming around the pike. But that's where my thoughts were. Thank you.
That would be super. That's actually great feedback. So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're suggesting we monitor active projects right now within, and you gave Caring for Denver as an example, and what we can use these funds for is help fill in those gaps that currently aren't really being addressed by current programs that are already in place. Is that a?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So there's like,
Perfect.
give a broad stroke to everybody. You have like Caring for Denver that has the mental health money on the tax credits there. Then you have the CPCC that does the reentry work, that's like has the AIDS Center, the SCCIC reentry pretrial initiatives. Then you have the JCC that has initiatives that they're doing at the Justice Crime Commission that I'm on. Also, at the same time, the mayor has huge initiatives that he just sent out. So he is kind of beating the streets on one project. He's got advocates and law enforcement out there. Then he's got organizations that he's going to team with, that he's hired with, that he has some ideas that he wants to do. There's also reentry stuff with Greg Morrow that's out there. Huge reentry stuff that he's doing with the alternative to halfway house things that are happening. So there's a lot of effective things that are happening, but what happens is we don't look at that. We're going to overlap some things, and we're just going to bolster somebody else's budget instead of, and it kind of just adds to their thing. If that's what we decide to do, great. But if we are bolstering budgets that are already set, it really doesn't get that money that's effective, that somebody just like adds that to the halfway house initiative or to the aid center or whatever. If we're going to get creative, we're going to say, hey, this is streamlined. Also, there's the opioid abatement money out there. So there's those committees in those regions that are happening. So that opioid abatement money that's there is an abundant amount of money. So if we're going to get the opioid abatement conversation, what are those committees doing and where are they sending that money during the year?
That's great feedback. If you have a list of active projects in place, if you can share those with me, like you mentioned earlier, I think that would be super helpful. And you actually reminded me of a great point I should have brought up when we shifted to this topic. Is another thing we're going to discuss and that could help drive this specific discussion is metrics for success. So we should, with each activity and effort that we put in place, we deem eligible for this program, there should be a metric or a way to track the success throughout those communities once that's taken for action. Good, Commissioner.
I love that feedback. And I like the ideas that Thomas brings up about kind of gap filling. And I think what I hear is that we're using those specific projects as examples of categories as opposed to very specific projects, because I think we're gonna find that they're going to be similar projects or different types of projects all throughout the state of Colorado. And this is even outside of Denver. And so I like the fact that he brought up that there are going to be other sources out there, and maybe the goal of this would be to make sure that it actually significantly advances a project, like through gap filler. I like how he used the term, kind of filling in some of those holes. But I also agree that it shouldn't just be something where somebody says, we want some money, and it throws in, it's a drop in the bucket, and it doesn't have a significant impact, which is how then you brought up the fact that how are we going to show the impact of these dollars? If we look at some of the, I'd maybe connect you after this with some of the folks that are helping us measure impact on the opioid councils. I sit on our regional opioid council, and you might get some ideas to come back to us at a future date on how to maybe track some of the metrics and how we're trying to make sure that there's that reverse kind of accountability, and also a little bit of the outcomes measurement. And so that I can't answer that today, but I do know that that's being done. And so like if Thomas has some ideas, like some from the Denver specific projects or groups, then we could do the same. We could all just kind of toss those to you, and you could come back and say, look, here's some of the different ones that I saw, and then we can maybe make that decision in the future.
Absolutely. I think that sounds like a plan. And unless anybody's opposed to it, once we start looking at some of these active efforts and identifying what those gaps are that can actually be addressed with these program funds, we can start a ongoing discussion, likely through email, and identify what some of the most likely activities we could maybe look at and kick off could be. Go ahead, Debbie.
Just real quick, I respect and like both of the ideas that have been shared, but I am also really hypersensitive to underserved and more outlying communities beyond the metro area, because I think if we're looking at a gap filler in, let's say, where somebody's already got caring for Denver dollars, that's a larger pot of money already. And if we can find a way that smaller outlying counties are reporting or their district attorneys are reporting, then I would really like to see some of the dollars here spread, because I think proportionately you could make a very large difference with an input in an underserved area.
And that's a great point, Debbie. And actually, another point that's actually unfortunately not on this slide that we could discuss that could help drive this discussion too is whether or not we want to place a cap on an amount awarded. And I think if we did place a cap, that could help address the issue you just mentioned. For example, if there's an effort currently in place in Denver that we identified this program could fill in the gap for, we want to make sure that that program doesn't eat up all of our dollars. All of the 1.3 that's currently in our pot of money here goes to that Denver project. By putting a cap on that, we can ensure that there's enough funds to go around to different projects in underserved communities. So that's another discussion we can have here. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I like it. On some other committees that are on when you're doing the rural area, it kind of just gets broad strokes and then somebody gets left out, like the Native American community. Just being really strategic on like saying, hey, we have this amount of money. This is what we can concentrate on. We're talking about Pueblo. We're talking about Trinidad. We're talking about, you know what I mean?
Yep.
Those counties that are there. Also, that's an investigation on this committee. Who's doing what in those areas, because you can overlap, because there's a lot of people saying, hey, I want to throw stuff in the rural areas. So there's, you know, those tax credits that are out. There's a lot of need, like Pueblo right now is underwater with a lot of different projects that they need done. They don't have enough reentry programs. They don't have enough this. They don't have enough that. But I know that at the end of the day, every time that I'm on a community, the Native American community is left out. It's the last discussion, and everybody's trying to scrape the bottom of the barrel to figure out how we can get to the Native American community. And they're always in the underserved areas. I like us to see if we could kind of concentrate on that forefront with that rural area, and then make that pretty strategic that they can get that funding, because they never get anything. Ever.
Do you think that's something a cap could address or help resolve?
I believe so.
The next question would be, what do we think the cap should be if we did put that in place? I know that's kind of a difficult question to kind of process and answer, but we would need kind of an idea of what some of these activities are and would be to kind of come up with that cap. Go ahead, Commissioner. I think you're on mute.
Sorry. One of the things we did with our opioid council, and I'm just bringing it up as an example, was that we took some of these categories and we assigned some sort of, like, it was a broad, general, not hard, rigid, but kind of guiding, saying, look, this body thinks that this particular category, and if you're looking at the 3 or 4 categories up here, we would kind of create some, like, okay, 20% here, 30% here, 20% here, let's just shoot for that. And then we can always move it, like, once we figured out how many people applied. But by doing that, we say, look, we really want to push community policing. We think community drug intervention, but even for the sake of just discussion, you could do 25% for each one, see if people want to move it based on what we hear out there. Separate from that, a different intersection, different, I guess, layer of analysis would be, we could do the same thing and saying, even though these are focused on categories or topics, we could do the same thing and say 50% should be outside of the Denver or Denver metro area of whatever we do. It would be broad, like, again, aspirational guidance, not, rigid, but it would kind of give the message to folks, like, hey, when they see this, if there's some sort of communication that goes out, like what the folks at Thomas is referring to, we can actually send something to the folks in those communities, in those advocacy organizations, and say, look, we are intentionally, wanting to make sure that this pot of money is equitably distributed throughout Colorado. So you have the geographic diversity. You also have the topical diversity of distribution based on what we think is the most needed. And right now, maybe we don't have the data to just, decide on our own, but at least gives us and then as we get more data and input, we can always, with that feedback loop, make modifications to those percentages. This is just an idea. And again, it could just be for the sake of messaging and an aspiration, but at least it shows an intention to try to reach out. Thomas, do you think that would be helpful? I see Debbie's got her hand up.
Oh, I'll wait for Thomas to respond to you, then I can say something. Or I'll respond. I just want to make sure that if we put sort of a percentage out there so that it was more equitable disbursement, we still have the caveat that systems need to have reported that they have seized or have forfeited property. And so I still think, we can't just evenly disperse until we also know the systems that would even be qualifying. Is that my understanding?
I think so. And to summarize your point, what we're suggesting here is instead of a cap per project, let's say $30,000 for each project that we accept, we're saying a cap per category. So of that 1.3 million, if I'm understanding it correctly, we're suggesting 30%, just a random percentage, would go to drug intervention and prevention. Let's say another 30% would go to treatment and recovery, and another 30 would go to policing and outreach. Is that a good summary?
It was just like an example of what we could say is that we don't want it to be all taken by one group or one topic. But I also think that the other piece that I was proposing is some sort of geographic equity piece. But then what Debbie brings up is that even before you get to that point, getting in the door with eligibility is a different obstacle or hurdle that they have to get through. And I think it's fair to recognize that while we have an aspiration for equitable distribution, you still have to have eligibility, which is fairly set in our either statutorily or I think you said statutory, at least in policy.
Yes. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I like where this conversation is going. One thing we have to be careful about with caps is if we set a $50,000 cap, we're going to get a bunch of $50,000 applications. Or, maybe we don't have a cap and we get $1 million applications. But I think one thing we can do is, with most of our programs, we'll often get a application for $500,000 and our recommendation might be partial funding. So maybe we fund 200,000 of that. And all that to say is we don't necessarily need to put anything in our policies and procedures at that point, but we can have that discussion once we have the applications in hand and kind of let the applications give us a good indication of demand. Everybody might be coming in for community outreach in one particular cycle. So I wouldn't want to, constrain the local governments on what they're saying their needs are. But we can exercise some judgment, as we're looking at those in totality. And we have experts here from the law enforcement community that can kind of help us out and say, this type of intervention is more successful than this other type of intervention. And we can prioritize it that way.
Dave, I appreciate your perspective. That's actually, I really like that idea.
Dave, I think that's a really good point. And here's an idea for the committee, and I'll back up a couple slides, is I think because there's going to be a lot of discretion involved because we don't know the nature of the projects that are going to come in until we open the application, is we could actually add that to the rating criteria here for our subjective purposes in terms of how much has already been awarded to, let's say, policing and outreach, or rather, let me phrase that differently. Of the applications that we've received, of these applications, how many are for policing and outreach as opposed to drug intervention and prevention? If we have a diverse pool of applications in terms of purpose, we could use our own judgment in terms of where's this money going, and we can try to distribute it as evenly as we can. Does that make sense, or what do you guys think of that idea?
I think it makes sense. I just want to make sure that we are equitable between a law enforcement agency being able to go for an internal need as opposed to, I'm hearing a lot of examples here as external needs. Because oftentimes, especially in smaller law enforcement agencies, they don't have the resources internally to help their law enforcement officers and staff feel safe, be safe, have the support they need. So I hope we can offer a balance internally and externally to what could be asked for.
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, well, first I want to kind of respond to Debbie's point. I think a lot of what you're talking about, and in your previous example, we have a peace officer mental health program that is specifically set up for that. So part of this, if we get an application that is centered around that, we can take that application and reach out and connect them to that other program. If that's more appropriate. As I read this legislation, it seems like it's more externally focused. But that said, if a police department needs personnel to do that community outreach and have more of a presence in certain communities, that's sort of both an internal and an external. Like we're giving them the capacity to go out and do the external thing. To Mitch, to your point about the scoring criteria, I think one of the things we might want to look at, and maybe it's under demonstration of need, is this an evidence-based approach to meeting the criteria of this program? In other words, I'm trying to think of some examples, but maybe one application is for more community policing or or larger presence in schools, whatever the case might be. And another application might be for something that doesn't necessarily have a documented proof that it's effective. I mean, I think that should be part of our scoring criteria, is what they're actually going to do with the money and whether it's an effective use of that money. And I think part of that ties to, within the application, we should have what are the expected outcomes.
That's a great point. And I can either add that to an existing category, or I could create a new category to address your point, Dave, as well as how these funds would be distributed throughout the communities should that application be accepted. And going back to the commissioner's point, this would look like it, in terms of where are these funds going geographically, where are these funds going in terms of the nature of the project? Is it for drug intervention prevention? Is it for policing and outreach? In fact, Dave, I think you bring up a great point. I'm actually going to add that to our existing criteria, I think, currently as is. So we'll have that additional piece of criteria. I think that's a really good idea. So demonstration of effectiveness or proven effectiveness of the suggested plan within the application. I think that's
and I think to Debbie's point and the commissioner's point, one thing we can look at, if we get a bunch of applications and it's all Denver, we can make a determination at that point in time of, no more than 20% of the funds can go to one county. That's another way of sort of capping it without kind of pointing fingers at the Denver and the Auroras who, are the biggest and probably will come in with the most forfeitures as well. But that's a way we can address it, get more money out to the rural communities.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, we wouldn't necessarily set a hard and fast cap here within the policies. We would keep it more subjective when we're actually looking at the applications that are coming through.
Yeah, but I do think it'd be worth putting in our policies and procedures something about considering geographic diversity. Just some things, particularly when we get new committee members on board. What are the things that we're looking at in evaluating these and determining final awards based on the applications?
That's a good idea. Go ahead, Debbie.
Just a quick point of clarification, as I'm going through the bill on paren number D, capital letter D, it says to ensure that grant money is only used for operations and investigations, training and education, equipment and supplies, joint law enforcement and public safety operations, supportive community-based programs, or any other purpose that would have been permissible under federal equitable sharing guidelines. And so I'm going to keep reading because maybe there's also a broader use. I guess I kind of still see that supports the internal and external use of how these dollars are spent.
I wouldn't necessarily say it must be internal or external. I agree with Dave in terms of the language of both the bill and the statute lean more toward an external use. But what I would say is if an application came through for equipment like you mentioned earlier, I think it would be important for the applicant to demonstrate within that application of how this actually impacts the community at large, if that makes sense. So if there's a specific need within that police department that can't for some reason be addressed by another program like Dave mentioned earlier, our peace officers mental health program, demonstrate what the need is and how this actually impacts the community at large. I would look at it through that perspective.
Gotcha. Thank you.
What does everyone think of the idea of adding additional rating criteria to our list here that covers geographic diversity?
I think that you could also add cultural diversity as well. I think you could give a score. It's a factor, not a criterion. You can score. Factors are flexible. Criterions are rigid. You have criteria that you'll use for the eligibility, which is fairly rigid based on law. That's the stuff that Debbie was talking about earlier. You're either eligible or you're not. It's complete or it's not. Those are things that are kind of the pre-work. It sounds like Mitchell, your team, or whoever's maybe Eric Bergman will be doing. And then when we get to the flexible stuff, it's criterion. We can have that. And so some of the other criterion we talked about are geographic diversity. We could do the cultural diversity. We could also give criterion ratings for the different topics if we wanted to. If not, we don't have to. And then you could also do it based on the fiscal piece where you could say, do we want this? Do we prefer that the grant be the first money into a project or the last money into a project, meaning gap filling at the end and they've had to have gone with some, or do we just want to say that we want to know that you will get like a grading based on how much you're letting this money be used as a gap filler or stretch it with is there other funding that's going to participate in this? And so that you could say that very generally as a criterion to say, look, 1 through 4, we're going to grade you and say, like, if this is the only money for the whole project, it might get a 1. But if this is like 20% and you're getting 80% through other revenues, it shows that you're stretching these dollars out, and it might be a higher grade on that one criterion. So there's other factors, or the other factor I should use. There's other factors we might be able to add to cover some of the other questions that came up today, which were, do we want all the money being used for one project? Do we want people to use this to cover 100% of each project? And I'm saying keep it flexible. So in one situation, $10,000 might cover the entire project. On the other hand, we don't want somebody to come in with a $100,000 project and take up all $100,000. And so you might be able to put some factors in grading to see, like, you get a higher grading if you're stretching these dollars with other revenues.
That makes a lot of sense. Something else to keep in mind with this first set of applications is currently we have no idea at this point of how many applications are going to be submitted, the nature of those applications or projects, what those are going to be. There's a lot of ambiguity around this first application cycle. We're definitely going to have a lot of lessons learned in terms of who's going to apply, what kind of projects we are going to be looking at. once we circle back to rate these applications and open up the next or future applications. We'll certainly have to probably revise the rating criteria around what we see coming through and for future application cycles. I would say after this one, but that's just something to keep in mind. Right now we have, or I have no idea of in terms of how many, how much, and the nature of those projects that we're going to be looking at. So, Commissioner, you're absolutely right. It's a good idea to keep it general, for sure. The idea, the more I think about this, the idea of splitting percentages into categories such as policing and outreach versus drug intervention prevention, that's going to be a little tricky to do, I think, for this first application cycle, just because we don't know the nature of the projects that are going to be submitted, but we'll definitely get a better feel for that when we circle back again. So what does everybody else think about that? We could end up getting a lot. We could end up getting a few. Generally, the way this is going to work is once I develop the application and open it within our grants portal system, I'm going to go ahead and advertise it both on our website, and I'll probably reach out to agencies specifically if they've reported seizures or forfeitures and just let them know of the funding opportunity in terms of who's actually going to apply and for what projects. We're going to learn on the go, I think, as those applications come in. So I think like you mentioned, if we can keep things general for this first cycle, I think the better. But I do think if we add rating criteria for geographic diversity, I think that is doable given these ambiguity factors. So we'll be able to tell where those applications are coming from, and I think we can control making sure that all funding doesn't go to Denver or Aurora, for example, and we can address these underserved communities. Go ahead, Debbie.
Just a quick comment. It's important to note in the bill, it says that these requests can supplement but not supplant. And so that's probably important to be clear about.
Absolutely. Great point. Thank you for sharing. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I think just kind of echoing what the commissioner was saying earlier, I think when we're looking at this, there's actual rating criteria where you're going to give somebody a 1 through 5 based on some score versus the judgment that we're going to use in allocating these funds. And right now, we don't know if it's going to be a undersubscribed program or an oversubscribed program. So things like geographic diversity, I think it's harder to put a number to that. Like you can't really say Huerfano County is a 5 and Teller County is only a 3. So I think that's one where we have to just kind of look at it. We rank the projects, and if one is sucking up all the money, that's where we do a kind of a partial so we can get that geographic diversity. But it's not a 1 through 5 kind of thing.
That makes a lot of sense. I think what I had in mind as we were discussing it was a general rating criteria question in terms of once we're looking at this pool of applications, and maybe this isn't even possible, is of the applications that are scoring high, a general question related to is this a community, is this a region that is already receiving funding from other applications or projects? Something along those lines. But that may not even be doable until we have a full application pool. What are folks' thoughts on that?
So on that point, we need to make sure that part of the application asks that question. Like what other, are we leveraging this with other programs? Is this a standalone program? But we may not actually know, because there's probably a lot of nonprofits out there doing this kind of work that may not be engaged in that application process. So that's just something to think about. I don't know that we can actually know how much other money is being spent in Trinidad, for example, on recovery and that sort of thing. I think the community policing is going to be a little bit easier because the applications are coming through the law enforcement community and they're going to kind of know what they're doing. But I think when we get into some of these categories, it's going to really be hard to wrap your arms around that, I think.
And maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be a piece of rating criteria with a numeric value. Maybe it's something when we circle back to actually determine awards or for these applications and who's going to get a contract. We can just have a discussion in terms of where is this application coming from geographically, just to make sure not everything goes to the Denver metro region. I'm just thinking about logistically how it's going to look like, assuming that applications are going to trickle in over a 2-month period. We'll say it's going to be hard, especially in the first week or two, gauging whether or not an applicant already is going to, rather, there's going to be multiple applications coming in for one region. So maybe it's just something we circle back with when we review these applications once we have a full poll as a group. The only thing I think to consider there, if we don't make it a piece of actual rating criteria with a numeric value, is if we have applications, let's say we've got quite a bit coming through for the Denver metro area. If they have high numeric values, I guess it would just be a question of how will we justify not accepting those applications if it came down to it over an application with possibly a lower value, but they are in a geographically underserved region. So it's just something to think about. And what I'll do is I'll start thinking about ways in which this could be, given what I just said in terms of how these applications are going to be submitted and received, how this could actually be doable as we're reviewing them. And if I can think of something, a general way of putting that within our rating criteria, where it would be practical, I'll go ahead and share it with the committee, probably through email, and gauge interest or whether or not we should proceed with that in that direction.
I think I think the more flexible you make the criteria, maybe where we're having to grade it, 1 through whatever you do, but then also say that there's some other factors that are not gradable that we take into account, and that there is some deliberation or some analysis that is going to be done collectively by the group to make sure that we're doing this in the most equitable possible and stretch the dollars as far as possible. And in some statement along those lines, as you in your upfront communication, so you set the expectation that if you ask for all of it, you're not going to get all of it, and they can at least understand that here's some other factors that we consider, even if we don't put a quote unquote grade to it.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. I can definitely put something like that within the application without adding it to our rating criteria. That makes a lot of sense.
And I've said a lot, so I'm going to be quiet. I'd like to hear from more of the other folks. My apologies to everyone.
And if anybody has idea in terms of specific need throughout our communities, feel free to share with the committee. Go ahead.
So I just want to reiterate what you were saying earlier, was giving ourselves the generalization and broad flexibility that we can revisit later. As far as, identifying those needs within the community, it's really upon the applicant to articulate, how those impacts are going to be made based on what they're requesting.
That makes a lot of sense. And if I understand that correctly, what we're suggesting is not necessarily further defining the activities that are on our screen here, um, but really leaving it up to the applicant to demonstrate that need to the community. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, the articulable need for the funds to have the impact intended on the community. Yes.
It makes a lot of sense. What does everybody else think about that? See a lot of thumbs up. I think that's definitely a good plan moving forward into the first application. I don't see any reason we shouldn't be able to open up the first application that way. And if we do need to revisit and further narrow down activities in a future application cycle, we can go ahead and do that. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I think to echo that last point, we're gonna have a list, basically a list of awards, and probably some write up of the criteria that was used. So we can kind of cover it that way and don't need to be that restrictive. But one thing I would like to put out to the group as a suggestion for adding to the rating criteria itself that is numeric is I would like to see some kind of, and this is kind of back to Thomas's point, some kind of specific criteria around underserved or traditionally underserved communities so that we can score those higher. If, for example, they serve the tribal community or other traditional underserved communities in the area. So just want to put that out there and get some feedback on that.
And actually, the way you stated that, Dave, I don't see any reason why I couldn't add that as a piece of rating criteria. So is this a traditionally underserved community? Or another way to word it would be if we know specific communities that are underserved, we could even get specific with that question too.
Yeah, we could use the social vulnerability index or some other criteria to kind of figure that out.
Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Does anybody else have any points or comments or suggestions related to specific activities defined within statute and how we should bring this to the application? In that case, we have a couple action items. I can go ahead and start coming up with ways of how to add rating criteria to underserved communities. I don't see why that just can't be a piece of rating criteria, so I'll start coming up with language for that. As well as to determine, and we talked about this earlier, it sounds like it's probably more practical to circle back as a committee to determine geographical need as opposed to trying to fit that into the actual rating criteria. So I'll actually leave that out as an action item for now. But what I will do is I'll develop another piece of rating criteria for underserved communities. Go ahead, Dave.
A process question. We talked about a couple things around the rating criteria. And I think we want to have some modifications made. Can we do this via email? Like, can we share
Absolutely.
the document after you've made edits and have people just give it thumbs up or thumbs down via email, or do we need to reconvene and have a meeting? Brett's nodding his head. Yes, you have to have another meeting.
I think per the public meetings rules requirements, we can't approve these via email. We can approve them in thought and in practice, but to take the vote, we have to have another meeting. So I was going to bring that up before we got too far along here. So we can still do that, and it wouldn't take, but it would be a 10 or 15-minute meeting, which I think Energy Impact does that. They pull people together for a quick meeting just to go through those few points, which will be needed here.
Okay.
So what I'll do then in that case is I'll go ahead and start the discussion through email. Once we start making progress and determine a direction for that rating criteria, we can go ahead and just schedule a short meeting for the committee to go ahead and rule on that action, if that's okay.
And I think we should, and then any of these edits we can also do in pop them, because I think it's going to affect the policies and procedures just a bit. So I'd say we hold off on that as well until we get to that point. I don't think we need to take that today, because I know we talked about in those about not, talking about a cap, but I think we got a whole bunch of information out of this that we could probably address in, broadly, how we're going to consider some things that we can put into policies and procedures, as Dave pointed out, for future members, so they kind of get a gist of it as part of like their entry package. Here's our policies and procedures they can read up. But I think you could probably do the bylaws today.
Okay. So with that, if we don't have any additional feedback, the next steps would be I would come up with the language for the edits to our rating criteria around underserved communities. I'll start that thread through email with the committee here, and once we start determining or narrowing down on a specific direction, or if we're good with that language, we'll go ahead and schedule a short committee meeting to take a vote. Is everybody okay with that?
Yeah, that sounds great. I have one more suggestion on the ratings is I think we should just take out the eligibility rating. There's no reason to give a number to, because everybody should get that number.
That's a good point. So I'll go ahead and do that as well too. And what I'll do is I'll change that. I could change that whole category to reflect underserved communities, and it might just be one bullet. I might be able to come up with multiple pieces of rating criteria, but that'll be a future discussion. We'll take a vote on it at a later time. Okay. Go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, just briefly, does the committee have any feelings on, right now, we generally have the scoring set up in a 1 versus a 0 or a 2 versus a 0, which ultimately may result in projects being a 7 versus a 6, which doesn't necessarily make the appearance of showing one project to be far ahead of another. Would the committee prefer having scoring slightly larger so that some of the projects do start to rise to the top and more easily or noticeably rising to the top? Or does everybody feel fine with lower numbers? And then is that a thumbs up that you like it the way it is? Oh.
I'll clarify. It's a thumbs up for, I think, a larger numerical criteria would give us that flexibility and really have the outliers more evident.
Okay. That's an easy one. So
I can up this to just a different metric. Does
well, because I think right now it's like a yes or a no, Mitchell, I think is the way, when we kind of looked at it, when we talked before, it takes away a little bit of maybe that subjectivity that maybe a committee member may want if they're looking at something. So maybe if you have a score that's just not yes or no, and it allows them to say, this is a 2 to me, or this is a 3 to me, it may allow for some of that as well. Because everybody's going to have an independent feeling about how a project meets that criteria.
That makes total sense.
That's the way a lot of the other programs work. It doesn't mean that the scores may all end up the same, but it allows for some of that flexibility with each committee member coming from different backgrounds, coming from different areas, different thoughts on something.
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, so Brett's just sort of triggered my thought, and that I've seen committees work in two ways. And Some committees, they take everybody's score and they average them. And that's the score for that, and they add them up and that's the score for that project. Others, they show all the scores, but then they do a consensus scoring. And so, like, we'll talk about it and say, well, why did, the commissioner rate that a 3, but maybe Debbie rated it a 7? And we have that conversation and arrive at a single number for the group. So I was just curious on what you're envisioning there, or if that's something we need to talk about and decide in advance.
I agree, and that makes total sense. I think when I developed this rating criteria that we're looking at now, some of these questions, especially in the first category, are hard and fast. Is this eligible or is this not? And I think that's how I was looking at the rest of the rating criteria. But since we're removing this category altogether, that makes total sense. What I'll do is I'll just create each one of these points here as, let's say, a 1 through 5. If we feel that's appropriate, I can also make the range larger too, if we want. Go ahead, Brett.
Well, and you and I can run a test on it, because sometimes once the numbers get too large, it becomes really difficult to determine what's the difference between a 10 and a 5.
Yeah.
So I do think you still want to keep, and you and I can chat about this just from years of doing this. But to Dave's point, I've historically seen more issues with allowing scores of individual committee members to be seen by other committee members, because it could affect how they want to score a project, versus because then they're afraid to maybe take a stance against something. And so historically, with a lot of the programs I've worked on, we've averaged those scores, keeping each of the individual committee member scores private, which is what Mitchell was actually going to be doing with this. The final score that he was going to show was only going to be the total averaged. He'll have all that data, but then he wouldn't share that with each committee member or to the public. That's work product. The final score for the public or for the rest of the committee would just be the average score. I think that's that's specifically to Dave's point. Does the committee have a feeling on that?
Go ahead, Debbie.
Thank you. I just want to make sure, if we're putting out an average score, and I think that's probably protective and reasonable, that any of us that have a strong feeling about something can still have an opportunity to weigh in. And if we chose to weigh in, would there be a weight for that?
In terms of a weight for
considering a stronger position and trying to see if it could be factored in to accepting an average score, or whether there would be a way to adjust it if you got you're down to 3 programs that are in a certain position and 1 or 2 of the committee members really has a strong perception. Is there some way to sort of reevaluate or reassess a final score, or almost re-vote on it?
Dave, Brett, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's fine. For example, I mean, let's say there's a project out there and the average is a 5, and someone has knowledge that says, well, actually maybe that should be a 10. And let's just take the evidence-based efficacy of the program. Maybe 3 of the committee members had no idea that there was a study out there where in Minnesota it really made things work. And somebody had knowledge of that and they brought it up, then that might bring that score up. If we all talk about it and agree to it, I actually think that's totally appropriate. Brett, what do you think?
I agree, and we could do it one of 2 ways. It's either that final meeting once everybody's done all the work and we have all of the information, and this goes back to a little bit what you were saying earlier, Dave, is you look at each project and you really say, well, what is this funding level for this? And that's when a lot of these discussions can be had and are had. And you ultimately go, well, I didn't know these things. We could do it one of 2 ways. You either, everybody's going to still maybe have access to their sheet that Mitchell has shared with everybody, and you could go in and vote for it, immediately changing that score, because this thing is going to be live running, because he's going to be doing it through Google. So at any minute, we could change those scores. If we didn't want to do that, we could just discuss it and take into account exactly what Debbie just said, that this changes the way I feel about this. This absolutely deserves more funding than what the scoring shows. that becomes part of the record that the discussion in itself led to a higher funding amount. Because remember, these are ratings versus the funding. And those discussions will be had together. So we could do it either way. And I think we can kind of be flexible and see how it kind of comes to in the end. But knowing that Mitchell does have the ability to have everybody immediately score it after the initial discussion and after everybody sees the applications, it could change things after those discussions. So,
Brett, I really like that idea, especially because it's still within the control of each committee member in terms of how they would want to adjust that specific piece of criteria. So,
Right.
and just like you mentioned, the way these actual rating sheets are, they're a Google sheet, so you could have it up on the call. And if we're talking about a specific piece of criteria for that application, you can actually right then and there adjust your score, and it'll reflect on the average.
well, we wouldn't want everybody doing that for everyone all the time because it would be hard to have a really good conversation that moves forward. But it is possible to do it, and I think we should have those conversations, and we will.
Well, I think that since these are going to be recorded meetings, I think it'd be easier just to evaluate the scores. And if there is discussion, someone does think something isn't scored right, we just have the discussion and make the adjustment. And I think that would be more transparent rather than relying on everybody to kind of rescore after the fact individually. That's just my opinion. I just think from a process perspective, it would be easier.
Yeah, and it would help not allow everything to continually shift, and we're just moving things one at a time or discussing and changing the funding. I like that. But
And we actually may have members that have to recuse themselves, so that would also eliminate the issue of having Mitch have to try to figure out which scores to take out and that sort of thing.
Good point.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, I agree with this.
So in that case, is everybody okay if we take that for action, or we just plan on doing that if we have to reassess a specific score for a specific application? Once we do reconvene as a committee, we can go ahead and just take a group vote on determining what that new score should be.
Well, Mitchell, we can add this to the policies and procedures because we're going to need to add some of these anyway.
Good point.
Because we've learned a lot from this. So that will be for the next meeting when we come back and have kind of a final rating to vote on as well. So that we can have an email going with some of the policies and procedures, but definitely want to share those back out with everybody. Once you take, and I would say suggest listening to this call again, because there's been such great conversation since the break, and put a lot of that into those policies and procedures, and you and I can chat and get all that put in.
Absolutely. And we can take a vote on that with the rating criteria once we do reconvene.
And Mitch, can you do us a favor and any changes to the policies and procedures based on these conversations, go ahead and leave them in track changes or suggest mode so that when folks are reviewing it, they can just look at what's changed instead of having to kind of reevaluate the whole thing again.
And the way that would look, if I'm hearing you correctly, we would keep it in a Google Doc format so we could see those changes, or as opposed to a standalone Word document, which is what I shared out previously. Actually, I think it was a PDF. Are you okay with that, Dave?
Yeah, you can do it either way. I mean, if you do suggest mode in Google Docs and download it to Microsoft, it's gonna keep that in track changes. So we probably have some committee members who are used to Google. We probably have other committee members that are used to Microsoft, but you don't.
And I would recommend, I'd recommend probably a Word version, Mitchell, after we get that final draft version ready for everybody. Send it out in a Word doc. I think people are more familiar with Word generally. And then it will just be redlined most likely of the changes that occurred.
Okay.
But we could do both, like Dave said, for those that want to look at it the other way.
I can go ahead and do both. I'll link it to the Google Doc for folks that are comfortable with that. And I'll attach the updated Word version too, so you can see those changes.
Great.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and these action items that we see at the bottom of the screen, we'll go ahead and take those for action once we do reconvene as a committee. I have my action items um, for those in terms of making updates to the rating criteria as well as the program policies. So I'll let the group know as soon as I start taking those for action.
And did we want to go ahead and approve the bylaws? I don't think we had any edits there.
Good point. That we can do today.
Okay, I'll ask for a motion to approve the bylaws as written.
So moved.
I'll
Second?
second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, the bylaws are accepted as written. Thank you.
So then the next action, and actually this is a part of the conversation that we were just having, was identifying metrics for success. So naturally, this is going to come at a later time since we're going to be making changes to the rating criteria and the way these applications are going to be developed. It's going to be more subjective and on the applicant to actually demonstrate that. So I think something to keep in mind with this is when we're looking at applications and a project is being described within the application, are there ways to track this project, whatever it may be? And that could be another piece of rating criteria I could add. Is this trackable? Is this measurable? Or we can just leave that subjective to the group. What are some thoughts on that?
I've probably been talking too much, but personally, I think that we should make it part of the application and ask them to describe, any outputs or outcomes. We are going to have a challenge because some of these programs, it's very easy to say, I did X number of community hours, or counting how many public meetings or other outputs that they've had. But they're not going to have the capacity to say, I've reduced crime, that sort of thing. Now, they may be able to do a community survey to see if, like, the community's impression and confidence in the police force has improved because of these community outreach activities or those sorts of things. But I think we don't want to make it so difficult that they won't apply, but we do want them to think about what are the things they're going to produce with the money, and then what is the impact that they're expecting. But again, I don't think we can be too draconian on how they measure those impacts, because they're probably not going to have the capacity.
Go ahead, Debbie.
Well, thank you. I especially believe that if it's a smaller ask, they probably may not have the capacity to go on to do some kind of a community impact assessment. If they're asking for just $5,000 or $10,000. So I do think we have to be thoughtful about kind of a balance in there.
What I can do is, I think this is a really good idea in terms of putting it within the application as opposed to the rating criteria. What we can do, similar to other activities we've talked about earlier, is we can keep it pretty general and leave it to the applicant to kind of outline how they plan, if it's measurable, and how they can measure it, but leave it general. In terms of what that would specifically look like, I think that would come to fruition as we start seeing applications coming through and what they actually look like. Any more thoughts on that?
Amber has her hand up.
Oh, go ahead, Amber.
I think too, we should also look at like how frequently are we wanting updates on the project as well? Like, are we looking at biannually, quarterly? How would we be collecting this information from the individuals through like a generic Google form that we can have them updating progress on their project as well throughout the time that they're initiating the project?
It's a great point. It'll most likely be quarterly. But I think as applications and projects come through, I think we might have to revisit how we plan on actually tracking those metrics. Is it going to be something we do with the quarterly reports within our grants portal system, or is it something that we should be collecting through some other means? It's a great point. Anything else on that? My initial thought is I'll plan on adding that to the application, and I'll come up with specific language, but specifically keep it general, so that it's up to the applicant. We don't want to determine for them how they should measure each project, because we don't know the projects that are coming in. And like to your point, Debbie, we don't know their staffing capacity or resources available to be able to track a project, such as like in the case of a community survey. So I'll keep it as general as possible, but leave it up to them to tell us how they plan on, is it measurable, and how they plan on tracking it. It might be something we have to revisit down the road. Is this something, depending on the answers we get back within the application, is this something we can track within the quarterly reports, which is another thing I'm going to have to develop on my side of the house. And I can keep that in mind as I develop the report that they'll be submitting each quarter too. So, but is that something that they can actually report to us within that quarterly report, or is it something that I'm going to have to do additional outreach to that community to gauge what those metrics are? My goal would be to figure out a way to get it within that quarterly report. Any other comments, concerns? So I'll go ahead and take that as an action item for myself. When developing the application, I'll come up with generic language for the applicant within the application itself, so that they can tell us how they plan on tracking each project. And we'll go to the next slide. So with that, we'll go to our last action item and discuss opening the first application. So this will be the details of understanding the timelines we're looking at in terms of how long does it take to develop the application, open it, our timeline for review, and then that'll give us a direction for when we'll likely meet up again to review each application, or our scores rather. So these are just some dates I came up with in terms of opening the application. And actually, I would say ignore the dates for now, because just based on the discussion we've had previously related to eligible activities, as well as the rating criteria and some other action items I need to have in place, it's not likely going to stick to these dates I have on the screen for now. Once we do narrow down on criteria that we can agree upon, as well as the edits that need to be made to the program policies, my guesstimation is it's probably going to take about 2 weeks to develop that application and actually being able to open it. Once the application is open, my intention is to keep it open for about 2 months. And within that 2 months, I'm going to be reaching out to agencies and municipalities throughout the state that have reported seizures and forfeitures, and let them know of that funding opportunity. It'll also be available on our website. So my initial thought was keep it open for about 2 months, and that'll give us 2 months to review them as they come in. My plan for how this would actually work is, once an application comes through, and assuming it passes the eligibility requirements in terms of they've reported seizures or forfeitures, then I'll share those applications with the committee, and we can review them as they come in and rate them. So what's everyone's thoughts on that in terms of the timeline of keeping it open for 2 months and rating it that way? Perfect. And again, there's a lot of ambiguity involved. We may see a large influx of applications. we may see just a couple trickle in. So we'll see if we want to stick with that 2-month timeline with future applications. If a situation does come up in which we need to extend or adjust this, the amount of time this is open for, that's always possible as well too. However, with the relative amount of funding that we're looking at, that 1.3 million, I don't anticipate we'll have to keep this open longer for 2 months, but you never know. But it's possible if we need to. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, just a quick question on the application. Do you want this committee to review the application before it gets posted, or is the application largely just going to mirror the rating criteria and it doesn't really matter?
That's a really good question. My intention was to have it mirror the rating criteria for the most part. There would be portions of the application it's completely on the applicant to describe the project, describe metrics for success. But I'll actually kick that back to the committee here and gauge your thoughts on that. Would you want to review the application before it's actually open to the public? I see one thumbs up. Okay, we can do that. And what I'll do is once I develop it, and I'll actually take that as another action for our next meeting when we vote to approve the rating criteria and the edits to the program policies. I'll group that in there, the preliminary application, but I can also share it. Go ahead.
I think you were just about to say what I was going to suggest is, could we put it in a Google Doc
Yes.
to share for comment?
Yep. I'll put it in a Google Doc. I'll try, based on our grants portal system, when I capture the application out of that system in terms of the format, it's most likely going to be PDF. I'll try and actually transfer it to something that's editable and you can comment on, such as a Google Doc. But I'll let the committee know if I have issues with that, and we can figure out how to make comments to that PDF. I anticipate I should be able to transfer it, no problem. I can also shift it over to Word as well too for folks so that are more comfortable with that. So with the amount of thumbs up I just saw, it sounds like we do want to review that application as a committee. So I'll start a discussion and I'll start sharing with email or through email the first drafts of the application once I come up with those. And then again, similar to criteria and edits that need to be made to program policies, once a direction's determined and we set a meeting date in the future, we can go ahead and take a vote on that. Perfect.
That sounds good. I do have a quick question for the others. I think for your staff time and ease, it would be easier to have this in one Google Doc that everybody could comment on or suggest edits on, rather than have some folks doing Word and some folks doing this other document. I'm wondering, is there anybody on the committee who prefers Word over Google Doc, or can we agree on one or the other? And I don't think it's a showstopper if we have some people that can only use Google and some people that can only use Microsoft. But if everybody's comfortable in Google, I think that would be easier for staff, and then you can see everybody's edits at the same time. Let me phrase the question this way: is anybody uncomfortable with Google and doesn't want to get into a Google Doc? Okay, hearing none, then I think Mitch, you can go ahead and just put that in Google and save yourself a little effort and tracking the two different documents.
Perfect. And if anybody changes their mind and they do need assistance with Google, you can always reach out to me and I can walk you through the document, specifically how to do certain things. So feel free to reach out. Again, ignore these dates. These are probably going to shift at least by a couple months just based on the action items we're taking away from this meeting with. The next step after we vote upon the application, we approve it as a committee, is going to be opening the application. We'll keep it open for 2 months. Then we're going to circle back as a committee to discuss, and we mentioned this earlier, the actual scores for each application and which applications should receive awards. Go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I would recommend that we don't make the application an actionable item. And I say that because if we vote on it as a group, I think we do get it to where everybody's comfortable with it. But say you have to add in something when you're going to publish it and something needs to change, then we have to go back and take action again. I would recommend that we just come to an agreement. I mean, because the application is going to mirror the 40 other types of applications we have to some degree. So we're really just talking about making sure that we don't miss any of those questions in there and those types of things. So that I would just say that.
Is everybody okay with that? Perfect. So I'll include it within the discussions alongside the edits to the program policies and rating criteria, but it's not something that we'll plan on taking a vote on. So we'll circle back after the application closes out. It'll likely be, just looking at the timeline, it'll likely be early next year, possibly January maybe. We'll rate those applications based on what came in and what scores we're looking at. And it usually takes about a month to actually get those awards processed and issued. So does anybody have any questions over that general timeline? Perfect. With that, I think that's the last item on our agenda. Just to review, so action items, and we've discussed this earlier. It's going to be, I'm going to make edits that we discussed to the program policies, make the edits to the rating criteria. I'm going to go ahead and open the first application. Thomas, if you're still on the call, if you can share projects that you're aware of with me in terms of what's active right now that you know of, I think that can help drive a discussion just in terms of overall awareness for the committee, what we should be looking at maybe in terms of specific projects. That would be very helpful. And I think that'll be it. The next step is going to be start discussion around the edits made to those documents I mentioned earlier, and then schedule the next committee meeting. In the next meeting, it'll be very short compared to this. Am I missing?
I have one other question on that. When we have that next meeting, and maybe this is a separate meeting, but at some point we're probably going to want to train up the committee on how to use the Google Forms for the rating once they're done. So we could either do that separately, or maybe we combine that with the next meeting.
That's a great question, and I'll actually leave that to the committee in terms of what you prefer. What I had in mind was I was going to create a detailed instructional email with the document once I share it out of how to use it. I've got to make the edits that we discussed earlier in terms of shifting those yes nos to an actual variable. Let's say 1 through 5, unless that's too small. So I'll make those edits, but I was going to create an instructional guide of how to use it, and I can circle up with anybody one-on-one if you have questions on how this document is used and how it's going to appear into the average. That was my initial thought, but if folks want a group training, I can do that too.
I'm actually fine with the email if everybody else is, and then that's one less meeting. Or shorten the next meeting. So I'm good with that. I'm sure it's going to be pretty self-explanatory.
Perfect. And if you have questions and you look at this and you're not sure what you're looking at, just reach out to me, and we can just jump on a one-on-one call, and I can walk you through the document and answer any questions you may have. So with that, are there any other questions related to anything we discussed today? If not, I'll go ahead and pass it to you, Dave, for adjournment.
All right. If there's nothing else for the good of the order, I'll ask for a motion to adjourn the meeting.
So moved.
Have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Well, thanks again for your service. I'm excited about this program, and we'll see you at the next meeting.
Thank you, everyone, for your hard work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Job, Mitchell.